Last year, when I was 22, I hit an all-time low. Work had fried every ounce of energy I had, and my life felt more like someone else's movie than my own reality. Without diving too deep, I'll just say my past wasn't exactly squeaky clean, and by then, I was trying to carve out some distance from it. What I needed most in that moment was a complete escape, just a brief one, a chance to unplug and breathe for a few days. You've likely been there yourself at some point. I must have been mumbling about it at work because a co-worker ended up recommending this tiny island off the coast of Maine. When he described it, it sounded almost comically dull, which for me was perfect. No nightlife, barely any tourists after dark, and practically deserted once the ferries stopped running for the day. His words sealed it when he mentioned that staying overnight was like having the whole island to yourself. Not long after, I stumbled upon a rental listing for a small seaside cottage there. It was surprisingly cheap and available right away, way too convenient to be legit in hindsight. But my head wasn't in a cautious place. I booked it right away without another thought. The cottage itself turned out to be modest. One small room with a bed, a kitchenette I didn't intend to use, and a cramped bathroom. It was tucked into dense coastal brush on 3 sides, leaving just the front facing the ocean. It had one window with a flimsy, thin curtain, barely offering any privacy, and walls that were about as soundproof as tissue paper. You could hear the slightest shuffle of the wind cutting through the bushes, like it was whispering directly in your ear. I noticed the door locks, a deadbolt and chain, not just because they seemed new, but because such precautions felt oddly unnecessary for such a remote spot. Still, I brushed off the thought. I arrived on the late afternoon ferry and decided to spend my evening wandering the island. It was surreal watching the place all but empty as day trippers headed back to the mainland. By sunset, it felt like I was the last human there. No streetlights, no cars rumbling by, not even a distant dog barking. Just me and the crash of waves breaking against the rocks. A lonely kind of beautiful. I ended up at a little pub near the ferry dock for dinner, where the bartender chatted with me while pouring drinks for just a handful of patrons. She seemed nice enough, but when I mentioned where I was staying, her expression shifted, a flicker of something. Surprise. Concern crossed her face for a split second before she covered it with polite disinterest. The tiny interaction stuck in my mind as I walked back to the cottage under the faint glow of stars. On my way back, I passed a dock nestled into a secluded cove not far from my rental. The boats moored there were mostly lobster fishing vessels, but one caught my attention. A small blue motorboat, clearly different from the others. It felt out of place, a detail that intrigued me ever so slightly. But I shrugged it off, filed it away as just another piece of local color. I reached the cottage around 10:30 p.m., locked both the deadbolt and chain on the door, and settled in for bed. Up until then, I'd been loving the quiet solitude. A break from noise and people was exactly what I needed, or so I thought. That peace broke when I realized my phone charger wasn't working, or maybe it was the outlet itself. Either way, my phone refused to charge. I tried every plug in the cottage to no avail. With my battery dwindling and certain to die within the hour, I made peace with it. At least I didn't need my phone for anything important, like the ferry ride back, since I had a physical ticket stashed in my bag. Giving up, I rolled into bed and fell asleep almost immediately, completely drained from my long week. At some point deep in the night, long after I'd fallen into what should have been an uninterrupted rest, I woke up suddenly. Something pulled me from sleep. I can't explain why exactly, but then I heard it, footsteps on the gravel just outside the cottage. They were slow and deliberate, pacing close to my door. Pausing after every few steps as if whoever, whatever, it was wanted each step to linger before taking another. It wasn't an animal scurrying around. These were steady footfalls that belonged to something or someone, with weight and purpose. I lay still in bed and shifted slightly without meaning to, just enough to cause the mattress springs to faintly creak beneath me. And that's when the footsteps stopped. The silence that filled its absence was thick, impossibly heavy and oppressive. My instincts screamed at me to stay frozen and not make another sound. In that moment of death, I heard them approach the cottage. Their footsteps stopped directly in front of the door, and my heart felt like it was about to break through my chest. I was terrified they could hear it pounding, but all I could do was stay completely still and silent. As if things weren't frightening enough, They turned on a flashlight and started shining it through the front door. Frozen in fear, I couldn't move. Then they clicked the light off and jiggled the door handle. My only hope was the deadbolt holding firm, and thankfully it did. For a moment I thought that might deter them, but I was wrong. Seconds later they tried again, this time putting more force into it. Then came the banging. The sound exploded in the cramped cottage, and I flinched with each impact. Loud, deliberate strikes. Somehow those relentless bangs jolted my mind back into focus. The threat became tangible, sharper. Even though my body still quaked with fear, I knew I couldn't just sit there. Without a clear plan, I sprang from the bed and crouched beside the door, scarcely breathing. I braced myself for what seemed inevitable. But instead of breaking in, the banging stopped. Silence consumed the room. For those few seconds, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing and their lingering presence behind the door. Then it happened. Something I can still hear as clearly now as I did then. Someone spoke. "I know you're in there, Leo." The deep male voice thundered in the silence, and I nearly lost control of myself on the spot. My name. They knew my name, and it was unmistakable that they knew I was there. Footsteps broke the silence, as whoever it was moved away from the door, trailing along the side of the cottage. My ears followed their path past the bathroom wall as he circled around, slow and deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. Every nerve in my body screamed that he was taunting me. Hearing him say my name drained whatever faint courage remained. Any confidence I had evaporated, leaving only a sickening wave of helplessness behind. For what felt like an eternity, though it could have been 20 minutes or maybe an hour, he paced around the cottage in circles. The steps crunched in maddening intervals, tilting between near and far. I had no idea what he was doing out there. A dark, trembling corner of my mind even silently begged him to just break the door down and end the unbearable suspense. But eventually the sound of his heavy boots faded into stillness. What followed was another sound, the growl of a small outboard motor coming from the direction of the dock. I crept to a window, staying low to avoid being seen, and watched as a boat pulled away from shore. The noise of its fading engine stretched across the water until it finally disappeared into nothingness. Sleep wasn't an option after that. I didn't so much as close my eyes all night. When morning finally emerged, weak light creeping through the windows, I bolted outside to investigate. The gravel surrounding the cottage bared silent testimony to their presence, heavy boot prints trampling a path around and around the house. The tracks led straight from the cottage to the dock and ended where a boat must have been moored. The rest of that day passed in a surreal haze. I returned the key to the property owner without explaining much. They wouldn't have believed me anyway, and left on the first ferry available. By the time I made it home, I was physically safe but mentally shattered. Here's what haunts me most. Whoever came to that cottage didn't belong to the island. They came from elsewhere by boat, straight to that one location on that specific night. They knew exactly where I'd be and somehow even knew my name. To this day, I don't have a single clue how they found me. When I confronted a co-worker about it, a guy who had first suggested I visit that island, he denied saying anything to anyone. He looked genuinely scared when I described what happened, and honestly, I believed him. To this day, though, I have no answers. Sure, as someone with, let's just say, a complicated past, it's not beyond belief that someone might harbor reasons to come after me. But how did they track me to such an obscure rental on some remote island off the Maine coast? How did they pinpoint both my exact location and timing so perfectly? These questions never leave me, even though that night happened years ago. In all that time since, nothing else significant has happened. I still live in the same town and work the same job, but part of me refuses to believe that it's over. Interestingly enough, right around that time of my life, something else happened that may or may not have been connected. If you're unfamiliar with Hiroshima, you might not recognize the name, but chances are you've encountered images of it without realizing. It's a desolate, ship-shaped island off the coast of Nagasaki, enveloped by crumbling concrete apartment blocks. Once a bustling coal mining site, Hiroshima was at its peak among the world's most densely populated places. But when the coal deposits were depleted in the 1970s, the island was abandoned and left to decay. Now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it draws tourists from around the globe. Visits, however, are strictly controlled. Guided tours are confined to a narrow concrete path along the seawall. with clear prohibitions against entering any of the deteriorating buildings due to their precarious state. That said, my visit was a bit different. I had special access to explore areas far beyond the usual tour route, a privilege that was both exhilarating and tinged with an undercurrent of unease. Of course, this came with conditions. I had to sign a daunting stack of waivers that essentially absolved anyone of liability should I get injured or worse. On the morning of my visit, I boarded an early ferry from Nagasaki. Unlike the boats used for tourist groups, this was a smaller vessel arranged through a research office. It was just me and my escort, a silent man named Tishi who seemed disinterested in small talk. I didn't mind. I was buzzing too much with anticipation. Seeing Hashima rise out of the horizon is almost like an optical illusion. At first, it barely registers, a small unassuming mass in the distance. But as you draw closer, details emerge and its true scale comes into focus. The formidable seawall wrapping around the island, protecting its dense maze of decrepit apartment buildings that seem stacked haphazardly upon one another. Even after poring over countless photos beforehand, nothing could have prepared me for the haunting majesty of seeing it in person. Once we docked, Tishi gave me a brief orientation. He explained that I would be allowed into several buildings outside the tourist-accessible zones, but laid down strict rules. Stick to designated paths, stay away from red-taped areas, don't take or disturb anything unnecessarily, and never leave his line of sight, a point he made sure to repeat twice for emphasis. I was also required to don safety gear, a hard hat, steel-toed boots, and bulky reinforced work pants that made walking a bit awkward. Despite this somewhat cumbersome setup, the first couple of hours were incredible. I darted around taking photos, jotting down notes, completely immersed in the experience. Tishi followed at a polite distance, but frequently glanced at his watch, clearly counting down until we could head back. Around midday, we entered one of the island's larger residential blocks. The stairs leading upward were surprisingly intact, but visibly fragile. You could even see sunlight filtering through gaps in some sections of the landings. For some reason, Tishi stayed on the ground floor while I ventured upward. In hindsight, this felt odd given his earlier insistence that I remain within his sight at all times, but honestly I wasn't going to argue. It was nice not to have him hovering. I reached the fourth floor and began examining a section of wall where decades of exposure had caused chunks of concrete to fall away, revealing rusting rebar beneath. As I studied it, something caught my attention. The layer of dust coating every surface wasn't uniform. Amidst the thick accumulation was a faint but discernible path where the dust had been disturbed, as if someone had walked this same route repeatedly over time. It didn't look fresh exactly, but recent enough that the dust hadn't fully settled back into place. My eyes followed the trail down the corridor to a door at its end, and curiosity got the better of me. I know I probably should have gone back down to inform Tishi. That would have been the responsible thing to do, but I couldn't resist investigating further. Besides, knowing him, he'd likely brush it off and insist we leave. So I carefully made my way to the door and pushed it open. The moment I stepped inside, two things struck me immediately, and neither made any sense. First was this smell, pungent and strange. It wasn't foul or organic like rotting animals or mildew, but something wholly unfamiliar and unnatural. The second thing was even more disconcerting. When my hand brushed against one of the walls, it was warm. Not just warm, it felt significantly hotter than any other surface I'd touched on the island up to that point. I stood frozen for what must have been half a minute, trying to make sense of it all. Perhaps you're thinking it could have been sunlight heating up the wall. Reasonable enough. But there weren't any visible openings in the ceiling or walls that could explain such localized warmth. And as for the uncanny smell, maybe it was from animals, though he didn't even ask me to take him to that room. When I suggested he follow me so I could show him the smell firsthand, he refused outright. His reaction was unsettling, to say the least. We continued the tour, but at that point, I couldn't shake this creeping sense of unease. I started paying closer attention every time he let me enter a building. Strange details began standing out, subtle, almost imperceptible things. No obvious giveaways like clothing or personal belongings, but odd markings and signs that something or someone had been there. The strange part was, I couldn't tell if these traces were left by a person or some kind of animal. It made no sense. At one point I pointed out more of these oddities to Kishi. This time he didn't even acknowledge me. Instead, he pulled out his radio and started speaking rapidly in Japanese. I had no idea what he was saying or who he might have been talking to, but it was the first time I'd seen him use the radio since we got off the boat. When I asked him what he said, his response was vague. He claimed he was checking the schedule. I didn't believe him for a second, but what could I do? Demand an explanation? I opted to let it go, though unease weighed heavier than ever. The way he was acting, it was as if he knew exactly what was happening and had no intention of letting me in on it. We eventually came to a tall residential block near the island's center. Keshi paused at the entrance, hesitating for a few seconds before reluctantly following me inside. His behavior struck me as strange. All morning he'd been impatient and aloof, but now he seemed unusually alert. I couldn't tell if it was fear or something else, but at that moment, it didn't matter. I wasn't about to let his odd behavior stop me from exploring. The building's stairwell was narrow and dimly lit, but otherwise seemed stable. We climbed up 5 floors, Keshi trailing closely behind me, a stark contrast to his earlier detachment. It wasn't until we entered a small corner room on the top floor that my growing unease turned into full-blown alarm. There, against one wall, was a pile of blankets and several empty water bottles. There was no mistaking it this time. This was undeniable evidence of human habitation. My mind raced as I tried to absorb what I was seeing. Once I managed to collect myself, I turned back to show Kishi. There was no way he'd dismiss my concerns after this. This was proof. But when I stepped into the hallway, Keshi was gone. He hadn't said a word, hadn't made a sound, he had just disappeared. That's when the fear truly struck me. Weirdly, it wasn't finding the items in the room that scared me most. It was discovering I was utterly alone up there. With Keshi gone, it felt like my mind snapped into sharp focus. Too sharp. For the first time, I realized how dire this situation truly was. Someone else was on this island. Panic surged through me like wildfire. A bizarre itching sensation spread across my skin, and resisting the urge to claw at myself took everything I had. My thoughts were clouded with fear. My only goal became leaving as soon as possible. I bolted back toward the stairwell we'd ascended earlier, determined to get out of the building and back to the safety of open air. But when I rounded the corner, I froze. The stairs were blocked by a spill of rubble completely obstructing my way down. I didn't stop to think whether the debris had fallen naturally or if it had been placed there intentionally. My instincts screamed at me to run, and that's exactly what I did. I sprinted back down the corridor past the room with the blankets, hoping there might be another way out, a second stairwell or some other exit. That's when I heard it, footsteps echoing in the hall behind me. The sound made my blood run cold. It started faintly, but grew louder with every second, deliberate and steady. My heart hammered in my chest as I fought off every instinct telling me to look back. No way in hell was I doing that. At first I thought it might be Keshi coming back for me, but then I realized there wasn't just one set of footsteps. There were multiple people behind me, closing in. My earlier fear erupted into sheer panic as I flew through corridor after corridor, my surroundings morphing into an unending labyrinth. Everything looked the same. Every turn led nowhere. Every closed door felt like another dead end. My mind struggled to process what was happening as terror clouded my thinking entirely. Then, by sheer luck or desperation, I finally found another stairwell. Without hesitation, I threw myself down the steps 2 at a time, my lungs It felt like he wasn't even listening to me. Every word I said just bounced off him, and the frustration was eating me alive. A part of me wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until he understood, but I knew that would be a terrible mistake. I couldn't afford to alienate him, not when he was literally my only way off the island. He held all the power and I had none. Still, his complete lack of reaction to my words made my anger boil over. For a brief moment, I caught myself actually wishing that whoever or whatever it was that had been stalking me earlier would pop up again, just so Kishi could see I wasn't making it all up. Instead, he waited silently for my outburst to fizzle out. Then, without even a hint of acknowledgement, he announced we were leaving. That was it. No comment, no explanation, no shared concern. I didn't know what to think. My mind was still racing from everything that had happened, anxiety gnawing at me, and his indifference only made it worse. It crossed my mind that maybe he knew more than he was letting on. Maybe he had something to do with the strange events on the island. Maybe he had even been responsible for the inexplicable pile of rubble. The thought chilled me to my core. The worst part was having to endure an entire ferry ride back to the mainland in tense, awkward silence beside him. Every passing minute, I wondered if I was in danger, if he might do something. But in the end, we made it back safely. Once we docked and I finally got away from him, my first instinct was to report everything I'd seen and experienced on the island. Most importantly, that I wasn't alone out there. The idea that people were living or lurking on Hashima felt deeply alarming. I reached out to the only person who made sense, Dr. Yamamoto. He had been instrumental in facilitating my visit to the island in the first place, so surely he'd take me seriously. But no matter how many times I tried, I couldn't get a hold of him. At first, I thought it was just bad timing. Disappointing, but not unusual. But 2 weeks later, by then back in the US, his continued silence started to feel sinister. It was like he had vanished from the face of the earth. To this day, years later, I strongly believe something was being hidden on that island. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to report my experience to anyone who might listen or care, I hit wall after wall of disbelief. Some probably thought I was exaggerating or flat out lying. Others just didn't want to get involved. It's left me haunted in a way that goes deeper than what happened on Hashima itself. Looking back now, and it's been, well, over a decade since this all went down, I don't just regret the fear or confusion I felt at the time. What stays with me is this gnawing feeling of unfinished business. Why didn't I do more back then? If only I had spoken Japanese or stayed longer. Instead of rushing back to finish my senior thesis, maybe I could have uncovered something important. Instead, all these years later, the mystery keeps tugging at me. At least I can say that my fascination with abandoned spaces wasn't some random hobby. I'd been deep into researching them for my thesis during my final semester of college as a history major. My project focused on abandoned institutional spaces, hospitals, asylums, rehab centers, places with forgotten histories hiding in plain sight near bustling cities. One of the sites I wrote about was North Brother Island in New York City, a decaying remnant of the past swallowed whole by nature and sealed off from public access. North Brother Island has an eerie history of its own. Once a quarantine hospital for infectious diseases, later a rehab facility, and eventually abandoned for decades. Even during my research years ago, stepping foot on it without a permit was illegal. It's safe to assume security measures have tightened even more since then. Oddly enough, visiting North Brother Island wasn't even on my wish list at first. It didn't seem worth the risk of getting caught trespassing. But that changed one drunken night with two friends, Jansen and Jesse. Over a few beers, I complained about how draining and frustrating the research process had been lately. To my surprise, they both showed genuine interest in my work, even though neither of them cared much for history. As soon as they found out one of the locations I was studying was lying dormant right there in New York City, it was all over. Jansen and Jesse were die-hard fans of urban exploration back then, a hobby that was gaining traction among young thrill-seekers at the time, and they convinced me this was a golden opportunity we couldn't pass up. Before long, their excitement became contagious, and we had packed plenty of supplies, probably more than we actually needed, but we preferred to err on the side of caution. The plan was ambitious. Set off around 2:30 a.m., explore the island for a few hours under the cover of darkness, and return before sunrise. It felt both reckless and exhilarating, the kind of thrill that makes your pulse race. Surprisingly, getting the kayaks into the water was seamless. I hadn't counted on how deserted the park would be at that hour, and it left me with an odd sense of freedom. But as soon as we paddled away from the shoreline toward the island, the reality of what we were doing began to sink in. There was no turning back now. With nothing stopping us, all that remained was to paddle. The initial rush of excitement gave way to nervous energy, an unsettling little knot in my stomach. Still, we pushed through and made it to the island. Pulling the kayaks ashore proved trickier than anticipated because of the overgrowth. Tall reeds and dense weeds made it challenging to find a stable spot to leave them behind. Stepping onto solid ground, The three of us stood in silence for a moment, taking it all in. Darkness cloaked everything, but with our flashlights and the moonlight cutting through the night sky, it was just enough to see the contours of the world around us. The first thing I noticed was how eerily quiet it was. Yes, it sounds like a cliché, but you have to understand. We were still technically in New York City. The Bronx was just half a mile away, yet it felt as though we'd stumbled into some remote, forgotten world. We started moving inland, and it wasn't long before Jansen and Jesse seemed to grasp just how expansive the island actually was. I had mentioned beforehand that it wasn't just a tiny speck of land. I'd even shown them a map. But their wide-eyed reactions made it clear they hadn't fully processed what we were getting into. The deeper we ventured, the more signs of human abandonment we saw, passing one crumbling building after another. Some structures had partially collapsed. Others were swallowed by weeds and vines, to the point where they were nearly unrecognizable as man-made. At one point, Jesse stopped dead in his tracks, mesmerized by a building split down the middle by a massive tree growing straight through it. "It's like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game," he said, comparing it to one where players scavenge through desolate remnants of civilization. He wasn't wrong. The sight was surreal, almost alien, as if the island had grown hostile to its history, deliberately erasing any trace of humanity's prior dominance. Looking around at nature's reclamation efforts, I remember thinking that if I didn't know better, I'd assume this place had been abandoned for centuries rather than just decades. We ventured into a few buildings that were still relatively intact, sweeping our flashlights across rooms that likely hadn't hosted visitors in years, if not longer. Most were disappointingly empty, little more than husks of what they once were. But in one of the larger buildings near a doorway, Jansen stumbled upon something unexpected, a half-empty can of spray paint. His eyes immediately lit up with mischief. "Let's tag something," he said, grinning mischievously. Jesse quickly jumped on board with the idea, but I wasn't having it. It felt disrespectful, not just to the remnants of the buildings themselves, but also to the lives and stories tied to them. People had lived and died here. This wasn't just some playground for us to deface. My objections didn't get far. "There's already graffiti everywhere," Jansen pointed out casually, while gesturing at some elaborate tags on nearby walls. "What's a little more going to hurt?" I argued back briefly, but realized I didn't have the energy to keep being the voice of reason. Finally, I relented. "Fine, do what you want, but I'm not going to stick around and watch." In hindsight, wandering off alone was probably a mistake. Fueled by frustration and looking for purpose in this eerie place, I decided to use the time exploring on my own and taking mental notes for my thesis. The deeper I ventured into one building, probably part of an old hospital complex, the more on edge I felt. It's one thing exploring an unsettling place with other people nearby. Their presence offers a kind of unspoken reassurance that nothing bad will happen while others are around. Being completely alone, that changes everything. As I edged down a long hallway illuminated only by my jittery flashlight beam, I suddenly heard Jesse's voice calling my name from somewhere ahead, a muffled sound from one of the rooms farther down the corridor. The unexpectedness made me jump. Instinctively, my body tensed even as it was unmistakably Jansen's voice that called out, and all it said was, "In here." I hesitated for a moment, but then started walking toward the sound. The doorway ahead was shrouded in darkness, even darker than the dim hallway I was already standing in. Peering inside, I couldn't make out a single thing. My first thought was that Jesse and Jansen were playing one of their usual pranks, trying to freak me out for wandering off. That sort of thing was right up Jansen's alley, and he'd find it hilarious if I fell for it. Without fully thinking it through, I stepped into the pitch-black room and swept my flashlight across the space. The beam stopped abruptly on a figure standing in a far corner, its back turned to me, facing the wall. For a brief instant, my brain scrambled to tell me it could be one of my friends, but deep down I knew it wasn't. It couldn't be. This person, or whatever it was huge. They stood at least 6.5 feet tall, probably taller. That ruled out both Jansen and Jesse. Neither was remotely close to that height. The sheer, chilling sight of that figure made my blood run cold. Before I even understood what I was doing, I screamed. It wasn't something I could stop or control. It just burst out raw and primal. Panic surged through me like lightning, and I bolted out of that room as fast as my legs could carry me, desperate to get away. At that point, being quiet or cautious didn't even cross my mind. I yelled for Jansen and Jesse as loudly as I could, shouting at them to run. Fear coursed through me so intensely that it felt like the figure would chase me down any second. Or worse, that something else was lurking in one of the other endless black doorways I sprinted past. Eventually, I found Jansen and Jesse near the spot where we'd originally split up. The moment they saw me tearing toward them in sheer terror, they didn't waste time asking questions. They just started running too. None of us slowed down until we finally reached the kayaks. Gasping for breath, I managed to tell them everything I'd seen. At first, they didn't believe me, which honestly made sense. If Jansen had come back spinning the same story, I probably would have thought he was trying to pull one over on me too. But something in my voice, or maybe just the sheer terror on my face, must have finally convinced them that I wasn't joking. In less than a minute, they went from skeptical to absolutely terrified themselves. Without another word, we decided we had to leave immediately. Whatever we'd come to see on that island, it wasn't worth sticking around any longer. But just as we were yanking the kayaks down toward the water's edge, all three of us heard it at the exact same time. A faint sound drifted out from the shadows behind us, a low, mournful moaning unraveling from somewhere deep in the darkness. It sounded eerily human, like an older woman crying quietly or groaning in pain. The sound wasn't loud. It was distant, but still clear enough to make our skin crawl. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. The fear plastered across Jesse and Jansen's faces mirrored exactly what I felt inside, pure dread. My hands were trembling so much, it barely felt like they belonged to me. We worked as fast as we could to get those kayaks into the water and push off from the shore. The paddle back took an eternity. At least it felt that way, but somehow we managed to escape unscathed. Once we were safely off the island and back on solid ground, none of us could stop talking about what had just happened. We relived every detail over and over again during the drive home, desperately trying to make sense of it all or cling to any kind of logical explanation. But no matter how much we dissected the events of that night, no matter how hard I tried, I kept coming back to one thing that scared me more than anything else: the voice in the hallway. It wasn't just any voice, it was Jesse's voice. And not just a vague resemblance, I mean exactly like his voice. I know Jesse's voice as well as my own. There's no mistaking it. Yet he hadn't been anywhere near that part of the building when I heard it. He was with Jansen the whole time. Over the years, I've thought about going back to that island again, not because I want to spend another night there, but because part of me desperately craves answers. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, returning is out of the question now. They've done everything they can to crack down on unauthorized access. As far as I've read, you